My name is Alina Carter, and I'm 24 years old. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, which is one of those quiet, well-kept suburbs of Chicago where the lawns are always trimmed and the neighbors wave at each other from across the street, and everyone's life from a certain distance appears to be proceeding exactly as planned. Our house was a two-story colonial on Elmwood Drive with a big oak tree in the front yard that I used to climb when I was small. My father, Richard Carter, ran a tech consulting business from a converted office in the basement. He was a careful, precise man who believed in spreadsheets and punctuality and the idea that a person's value could be measured by how reliably they showed up. My mother, Patricia, worked part-time as an administrative coordinator at a pediatric clinic nearby. She was warm and organized and had the particular gift of making any gathering feel festive without spending very much money. They were, by most measures, good parents. They worked hard. They showed up to recitals and graduation ceremonies. They made sure there was always food on the table and help with homework and a clean, safe place to sleep. But families have invisible economies that no one talks about openly. There are quiet allocations of attention and admiration, unspoken hierarchies that form in the early years and calcify over time into something that feels like fact. In our family, the economy was simple and unambiguous. Vanessa was the investment everyone believed in, and I was the steady, unremarkable background against which her brightness was meant to shine. Vanessa was 3 years older than me, and she had been extraordinary from the very beginning, not in a quiet or subtle way, in the loud, magnetic, undeniable way that forces a room to rearrange itself around one person. She was beautiful in the way that makes strangers feel slightly clumsy, with dark wavy hair and a wide, effortless smile that she deployed like a skilled technician. She was funny when she wanted to be, charming when it served her, and sharp enough to read a room within 30 seconds of walking into it. Teachers remembered her name years after she graduated. Family friends asked about her at every gathering. My parents' faces changed when she entered a space. They lit up, both of them, in the involuntary way that people react to something genuinely lovely, and I used to watch that change from wherever I was sitting and feel something I did not have a clean word for. Not quite jealousy, something more like the quiet bewilderment of a person standing in fog, unable to see clearly what is right in front of them. I was different. I was quieter, more interior, more comfortable with books and long walks, and the steady satisfaction of finishing a task correctly. I was not invisible. I had friends. I did well in school. I was the kind of person adults described as mature for her age, which is often a polite way of saying that a child has learned to take up less space than she is entitled to. I noticed things. I remembered details. I paid attention in the specific way that people who are not always the center of attention learn to pay attention, because observation becomes a form of participation when you are not the one being watched. I was the one who noticed when Dad's back was bothering him before he said anything about it. I was the one who drove him to his clinic appointments when Vanessa had plans she couldn't change, which was every single time. I was the one who helped Mom research florists and caterers for family parties, who showed up early and stayed late, who quietly handled the logistics, while Vanessa arrived at the right moment to charm the guests. I did not resent this. Exactly. It was simply the role I had been given, and I had grown comfortable inside it, the way you grow comfortable inside a coat that was never quite made for your body. You stop noticing the places where it doesn't fit. High school passed without incident. I graduated with strong grades and an academic scholarship to Northwestern University, where I studied marketing and digital strategy. Vanessa had gone to DePaul before dropping out after 2 years to pursue what she called a career in events, which mostly meant she helped organize corporate launches and product dinners for a mid-sized PR firm downtown. She was good at it, naturally, effortlessly good, the way she was good at everything that required presence and performance. My parents called her ambitious. They called me practical. It was meant as a compliment, I think. It did not always feel like one. At Northwestern, something happened to me that I had not expected. I found out that I was actually good at things. Not in a flashy, surface-level way, but in the deep, structural way that turns out to matter more over time. I had a genuine instinct for understanding what people wanted and how to communicate it clearly. My professors noticed. My classmates started coming to me for feedback on their work. I won a departmental award in my junior year for a digital campaign strategy one had built from scratch for a hypothetical mid-market retail brand. For the first time in my life, I was not the background. I was not the shadow. I was just myself. And it turned out that myself was capable of more than I had been led to believe. I graduated and went to work at a small but well-regarded digital marketing startup in Chicago's West Loop. The hours were long and the pay was modest, and the office smelled permanently of cold brew coffee and ambition. And I loved it with the quiet intensity of someone who has spent a long time waiting for a room that fits. I was good at the work. I learned fast, absorbed everything, and took on more than my job description required, because that was how I had always operated, by doing more than was asked and saying less than I felt. It was during this period that Vanessa met Kyle Mercer. Kyle was 34 when they started dating, which made him 7 years older than Vanessa and exactly 10 years older than me. He was a real estate developer based in Lincoln Park, the kind of man who had clearly spent years curating the impression he made on people. He was tall and well-dressed in the way that suggests a personal stylist rather than personal taste, with a handshake that was just slightly too firm and a habit of leaning in when he spoke, as though everything he said was a confidence being shared exclusively with you. The first time I met him, at a family dinner my mother had organized to officially introduce him, I remember watching his eyes while he talked. There was something there, a slight delay between what he was feeling and what he was showing, a calibration, like a person who has learned to perform warmth rather than feel it. I said nothing about this. What would I say? He made Vanessa happy, or at least he made her appear happy, which in the Carter family economy had always amounted to the same thing. My parents adored him immediately. My father shook his hand too enthusiastically and asked him questions about the real estate market with the focused attention he usually reserved for spreadsheets. My mother asked for the restaurant recommendation he had mentioned in passing and wrote it down on a small notepad she kept in her purse. Kyle charmed them both inside of 45 minutes, and by the time dessert arrived, they were already treating him like a son-in-law. The engagement was announced 6 months later at a family brunch with a ring that Vanessa held out across the table like an exhibit. My parents cried. Photographs were taken. I smiled and said congratulations and meant it genuinely, even though something in my chest had tightened slightly in the way it always did when the family's full attention gathered around Vanessa like weather around a low-pressure system. The wedding was set for the following August, 12 months of planning. And in those 12 months, I became, without anyone formally asking me or thanking me for it, the person who made everything actually happen. I coordinated with the vineyard venue. I managed the vendor timeline. When the florist dropped out 6 weeks before the date, I spent 3 evenings calling every available florist within 40 miles until I found one who could take the booking. When my mother got overwhelmed with the guest list logistics, I built a spreadsheet that organized every name, dietary restriction, seating preference, and RSVP status. When the caterer raised the per plate price 2 months out and Vanessa panicked, I negotiated them back down over a 40-minute phone call that Vanessa was too flustered to have herself. I drove to the venue twice to check setup details. I handled the bridesmaid dress coordination. I addressed envelopes. Nobody commented on any of this. It simply got done. And because it got done, it disappeared from everyone's awareness, the way infrastructure always does until it fails. Vanessa was not unkind to me during those months. She was not particularly kind, either. She was busy and preoccupied, and moving through her own experience of the period, which was entirely centered on herself, as was appropriate. She called me occasionally to report on things. Kyle had booked their honeymoon in the Maldives. Her dress had come in, and it was perfect. The photographer she wanted had had a cancellation, so she got him after all. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about my job or my life or whether the hours I was spending on her wedding were taking anything away from my own existence. She assumed, I think, in the way that people assume when they have always had someone quietly clearing the path ahead of them, that I was fine. I was fine. I was always fine. That was my role. The day of the wedding arrived with the kind of late summer perfection that feels almost theatrical, warm but not hot, clear sky, a light breeze that moved through the vineyard rows and carried the faint green smell of grape leaves. Guests arrived in their best clothes, sunlight catching earrings and cufflinks, and the venue looked exactly as we had planned it. The ceremony was held outdoors under a linen canopy. Vanessa was beautiful, genuinely, in a deep ivory gown that had been tailored to fit her exactly right. Kyle stood at the altar in a dark navy suit and looked at her with an expression that I could not quite read. Pride, perhaps, or ownership, or some combination of the two that in that light and from that distance looked enough like love to satisfy everyone watching. I stood in my dusty rose bridesmaid dress to the left of the canopy and held my small bouquet and watched my sister get married and felt the complex mixture of genuine happiness and melancholy that I imagine many younger siblings feel at such moments. A recognition that something is changing, that the family's already established map is being redrawn, and that your own position on it remains as unclear as it has always been. The ceremony was beautiful. The photos were taken. We moved inside for the reception, and the evening became what evenings like that always become, warm and loud and generous with food and wine, conversations blooming and wilting across tables, the kind of collective happiness that a wedding generates before the details fade, and only the feeling remains. I ate dinner with two of Vanessa's friends from work whom I barely knew. I drank one glass of white wine. I watched my parents move through the room with the particular glowing pride of parents at their child's wedding. And I thought, not for the first time, that I hoped one day they might look at something I had done with even a fraction of that light in their eyes. Then the speeches began. Kyle's best man went first, generic and mildly funny, the usual material. My mother gave a short, tearful speech about how she had always known Vanessa would find someone worthy of her. My father said something about legacy and character that got a round of applause. Then Vanessa stood up. She took the microphone from the DJ and turned to face the room, and she was radiant, confident, and composed, her dress catching the light, her smile exactly what it had always been, magnetic, effortless, designed. She thanked Kyle and her parents and her friends, and named several people individually with the practiced ease of someone who had been rehearsing this moment. Laughter in the right places, a few tears in the right places. People were charmed and moved and fully in her hand, as they always were. And then she looked at me. I was sitting at the table nearest to the small stage where the DJ had set up, and when her eyes found mine, I felt something shift in the air between us. Something I could not name, but recognized instinctively, the way you recognize a change in weather before you can see the clouds. Her smile did not change. Her posture did not change, but something behind her eyes moved. And in that fraction of a second before she spoke, some animal part of me understood that what was about to happen was not accidental. "Alina," she said, and every person in that room turned to look at me. "There's something I think you might want to address." I did not say anything. I was still trying to understand what was happening. "Kyle's investment account," she continued, her voice still calm, still pleasant on the surface, "lost $40,000 last month. And the transaction trail has some very interesting details. She paused, and the pause was theatrical in the way that only planned silences can be. I'm sure there's an explanation. I just thought, since we're all family here, this seemed like the right place to talk about it. The room did not erupt. It did something worse. It went quiet in that particular way that means everyone is absorbing something and deciding simultaneously how to react. I heard a glass being set down, somewhere behind me. I heard a chair shift. I heard my mother make a small sound. I tried to speak. My mouth opened, and something came out. I think it was, I don't know what you're talking about, but it came out wrong, fractured, too quiet, the voice of a person who is genuinely confused, and therefore sounds, to everyone watching, like a person who is guilty. Confusion and innocence are not the same performance. Innocence, when it has been ambushed, often sounds exactly like guilt. Vanessa nodded, as if I had confirmed something. She said, "Okay," in a tone that meant the opposite, and handed the microphone back to the DJ, and the evening stumbled back into motion around me like a crowd parting and closing around a dropped object. I looked at my parents. My father was staring at the tablecloth. My mother was looking at Vanessa with an expression that I recognized, the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to believe something she wanted to believe. She wanted to believe Vanessa. She had always wanted to believe Vanessa. That was the fundamental fact of our family's invisible economy. And in that moment, it was more visible than it had ever been. No one came to find me. No one sat down next to me and said, "Are you all right?" Or "What is she talking about?" I sat at that table for another 20 minutes while the music resumed and people danced and the cake was cut. And I was surrounded by people who were carefully, deliberately not looking at me, which is its own particular form of humiliation. Then I stood up, picked up my small clutch, and walked out to the parking lot and sat in my car under a sky full of late summer stars, and did not cry because I was not yet at the stage of grief where crying is available. I was still at the stage where everything is simply happening, and the body has not yet caught up with what the mind already knows. What I knew was this. My sister had accused me of stealing from her husband's investment account in front of our entire family and every person who mattered in my social world on the night of her wedding in a room full of witnesses. She had done it deliberately. She had planned it. The pause, the tone, the theater of it, none of that was accidental. And I had no idea why. I drove home that night in the particular numbness that follows shock, and I sat in my apartment for 2 days, barely moving, trying to understand what had just happened to my life. The calls started on the second day. Not calls from my parents asking if I was okay, calls from my parents asking me to explain myself. My father's voice was flat and controlled, which was how he sounded when he was most angry. My mother's voice was tight with the effort of remaining reasonable. They had talked to Vanessa. They had talked to Kyle. There were records, they said, of transactions. There was a paper trail of some kind. They did not know the details, but they knew that Vanessa had said something serious and public, and that serious and public things did not come from nowhere. I told them the truth. I had no access to Kyle's accounts. I had never transferred any money anywhere on his behalf or without his knowledge. I did not understand what transaction trail they were referring to, and I had not been shown any documentation. I told them this calmly and clearly, and with the specific precision of someone who knows exactly what the truth is and is trying to make other people see it. They did not believe me, or perhaps more accurately, they did not disbelieve me, but they did not fully believe me either. And in a situation like that, the doubt does all the same work as disbelief. My mother said she needed time to process everything. My father said it would be best for now if I gave the family some space. I asked how much space. He did not have an answer. The calls stopped coming. The texts went unanswered. My aunt, my mother's older sister, sent me a message saying that she thought it would be better for everyone if I stayed away from family events for the time being. A cousin I had been close to since childhood stopped responding entirely. Relatives I had spoken to every week for years went quiet. One by one, the way lights go off in a building when it closes, room by room, floor by floor, until you are standing outside in the dark, looking up at windows that are all dark now. The worst part was not the silence itself. The worst part was the way it confirmed something I had half suspected for a long time without ever letting myself fully think it, that my place in my family had always been conditional in a way that Vanessa's was not. Vanessa's place was permanent. She was the sun. The family orbited her by instinct, by love, by long habit. My place was earned month by month through reliability and effort and the quiet accumulation of tasks done correctly. And conditional places can be revoked. That is the nature of conditions. My job became difficult too. I had made the mistake at some point of telling a colleague about the wedding. Not in detail, just enough for the story to circulate, which stories always do. The office is a small world, and small worlds have their own versions of the family economy, alliances and reputations, and the whispered judgments that circulate faster than facts. I was not fired. Nothing so clean as that. But I was moved off a major account without explanation, and my manager started leaving me out of meetings he had previously included me in, and I could feel in the small daily transactions of professional life that someone had made a decision about me. I stayed for 3 more months. I went to work. I did my job carefully and completely the way I always did, because I did not know how to do it any other way. I ate lunch alone most days and spent the evenings in my apartment trying to figure out what my next move should be. I called a lawyer once to ask about defamation, but after a 30-minute consultation, he explained that what Vanessa had done, while deeply damaging, was difficult to pursue legally because she had framed it as a question rather than a direct accusation, and proving actual damages would be complex. I thanked him and paid his consultation fee and did not call again. In January, 5 months after the wedding, I accepted a junior position at a small marketing firm in Denver that I had found through a professional connection I had made at a conference the previous spring. The salary was slightly less than what I was making in Chicago. The title was a step back. The city was one where I knew no one and had no history and no family and no accumulated reputation of any kind. That last part, I decided, was not a drawback. It was the point. I packed everything I owned into a moving truck on a cold Saturday morning in February and drove west on I-88 and then I-80 toward the Rockies. And I did not look in the rearview mirror more than I had to, because looking backward had begun to feel like a form of self-harm that I could no longer afford. Denver in winter is a city that earns your respect before it earns your affection. The cold is dry and serious, and the mountains are a constant presence on the western horizon, enormous and impassive, indifferent to human drama in a way that I found, at that particular point in my life, deeply comforting. I found a small studio apartment in Capitol Hill, 400 square feet, a drafty window that rattled when the wind came down from the mountains, a neighbor 1 floor below who played acoustic guitar on weekend evenings in a way that was just musical enough not to qualify as noise. The apartment cost less than my Chicago place had and contained far less of everything. I had a bed, a desk, a small kitchen, and a view of a parking lot, and just above the parking lot, a slice of sky that was often remarkably blue. I started at the firm on a Monday morning in early March, walking into an office of 11 people who knew nothing about me except my resume. I introduced myself as Alina Carter, marketing strategist. They offered me coffee. Someone showed me where the printer was. The work began, and the work was familiar and solid and mine, and I held on to it the way you hold on to the side of a pool when you're still learning to swim, not gracefully, but with a grip that matters more than grace. The first year was genuinely hard, not dramatically hard in the way of films, where difficulty comes in visible and climactic forms, but quietly hard in the daily way, The loneliness of eating dinner in a small apartment every evening, the specific ache of having no one who knew your history, the way small professional setbacks feel enormous when there is no personal life to cushion them. I called my parents twice that first year. Both calls were brief and stilted and went nowhere. I did not call Vanessa. She did not call me. But I kept working. I kept showing up. I took on projects outside my job description. I taught myself Google Analytics and data visualization tools and the emerging practices of content strategy that the firm had not yet incorporated into their workflow. I wrote a proposal for a digital audit service that the firm could offer mid-market clients and presented it to the two partners who ran the company on a Tuesday afternoon when I had been there for 8 months. They looked at the proposal for a while and then looked at me and then looked at each other. And then one of them said, "How long did this take you?" And I said, "A few weeks." And he said, "We're going to need to talk about your title." I was promoted to senior strategist 14 months after I arrived. I was leading a team of 6 people within 2.5 years. By the time I had been in Denver for 3 years, I was managing the firm's largest accounts and had been offered a partnership track that I was still deciding whether to accept. The city opened up around me the way cities do when you stop being new in them. I found a running group that went out Sunday mornings on the trails above the city, and I discovered that I loved running in a way I had never had the time or mental space to discover before. The rhythm of it, the way it organized the inside of your head by occupying the outside of your body. I ran a half marathon in my second year and finished in a time that surprised me. I made friends, real ones, the kind that grow slowly from shared time and honest conversation rather than the proximity friendships of school or family. I dated someone named Daniel for almost a year, a structural engineer with a dry sense of humor and an extensive collection of topographic maps. And while it did not become what either of us had hoped it might, it was good and real and left both of us intact, which is more than can be said for a lot of relationships. I was, in the specific and understated way that survival allows, beginning to be okay. I did not stop thinking about the wedding. I do not want to give the impression that time simply erased it or that I healed neatly and moved on. The memory of that night lived in me the way certain injuries live in a body, not always acute, not always interfering, but present, accessible, capable of flaring without warning. I could be sitting in a meeting or running on a trail or falling asleep on a Sunday afternoon, and the image would come back with perfect clarity. Vanessa at the microphone, the room turning my parents' faces, the word disgrace spoken in no particular voice, but heard anyway, assembled from the silence of everyone who had chosen not to speak up for me. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, sitting in my Denver apartment with my running shoes by the door and my team of 6 and my small, constructed, genuinely mine life, was that the truth was already in motion, that the architecture of Vanessa's lie had been slowly accumulating its own structural problems for years, the way dishonestly constructed things always do. That the $40,000 that had never been stolen was, in fact, a thread, and that threads can be pulled. On a Tuesday evening in the second week of October, 4 years and 11 months after the wedding, I was sitting at my desk finishing a campaign brief when my phone buzzed with a text from a Chicago area code I did not recognize. I almost did not open it. I had learned, in the years since leaving Chicago, to treat unknown numbers from that area code with the particular caution of someone who has had enough surprises from that direction. But something made me tap the message, and what I read changed the shape of everything that came after it. The text was from a man named Marcus Webb, who identified himself as a financial compliance investigator working with a firm that had been retained in connection with a series of fraud allegations against Kyle Mercer's real estate development company. He had been investigating irregular transactions in Kyle's business accounts for the better part of 8 months. My name had appeared in documents related to a prior accusation, The one Vanessa had made at the wedding, which had apparently been preserved in some form of internal financial record, and he needed to inform me that the investigation had produced findings that were directly relevant to that accusation. He wrote, in the flat, careful language of someone trained to be precise, "The evidence does not support the original accusation against you. It never did. I think you deserve to know that." He said that Vanessa had been cooperating with the investigation for the past 6 weeks, and that she had provided his contact information to him and asked him to reach out to me. I read the message 3 times. Then I put the phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a long time, looking at the wall. I called Marcus Webb the next morning. He was professional and careful, and he gave me, over the course of a 40-minute conversation, the full shape of what had actually happened 5 years ago and what had been happening in the years since. Kyle's real estate company had been under investigation for the past year following a complaint filed by 2 investors who believed they had been defrauded. The investigation had expanded, as these things tend to, and in examining Kyle's financial records going back several years, auditors had discovered something that had not been part of the original complaint, a secondary account that had been opened approximately 4 months before the wedding in Vanessa's name, into which $40,000 had been transferred from a joint asset account that she and Kyle had established during their engagement. The transfer had been initiated by Vanessa. The account had been opened by Vanessa. The money had remained there, untouched, as what the investigator described as a privately held contingency fund, money she had moved quietly without Kyle's knowledge as a form of financial insurance in case the marriage failed quickly or badly. When Kyle had discovered the discrepancy in his accounts in the months before the wedding, he had come to Vanessa about it. She had told him, apparently, that she suspected me, that I had access to certain account login details through the wedding planning process, that I had been in possession of her laptop on at least one occasion, that there were reasons to believe I might have done something. These reasons were manufactured. She had given him just enough to redirect his attention and his anger away from herself and toward me. And then, at the wedding, she had taken the story public, not to protect herself directly, but to insulate the accusation in a layer of family drama that would make it harder to unpick later. A financial investigation, if one came, would find the accusation already established, already witnessed, already part of the social record of the family. It would look less like a frame-up and more like a lingering dispute. It had worked. For 5 years it had worked. Then Kyle's business began to collapse, and outside investigators arrived, and the financial records were examined by people who had no stake in the family story and no reason to accept its version of events. And the trail they found did not lead to me. It led, as it had always led, directly back to Vanessa. I sat with this information for several days. I went to work and ran my trails and ate my meals and slept in my apartment, and the information sat inside me like a stone that was slowly becoming lighter as I examined it from every angle. I had been right. I had known I was right, but being right and being believed are not the same thing, and I had spent 5 years in the gap between them. And what I felt now was not simple triumph, but something more complex, a mixture of vindication and grief and the strange, specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. I called Marcus Webb back and asked what, if anything, was required of me. He said that my cooperation would be helpful, but was not strictly necessary. The investigation had sufficient documentation to proceed without my involvement. He said that Vanessa, in her cooperation agreement, had agreed to make a formal acknowledgement of the original false accusation as part of the terms of her arrangement with investigators. He said, with the careful gentleness of someone who deals regularly with the human fallout of financial wrongdoing, that he thought it would be worth my while to go home. I booked a flight to Chicago for the following weekend. The flight was 2 hours, and I spent most of it looking out the window at the flat geometry of the Midwest unfolding below, the perfect squares of farmland, the silver threads of highways, the way the landscape became denser and more complex as we approached the city. I thought about the last time I had been on a plane heading into Chicago, which had been the flight out 5 years ago, sitting in a window seat with 2 suitcases checked in the hold and a one-way ticket, and the particular feeling of a person who is leaving because staying has become impossible. That person had been 27 years old and frightened and exhausted and still faintly in shock. I was 32 now, and I was none of those things. I was something quieter and more solid, something that had been built rather than simply survived. My parents met me at the house on Elmwood Drive. I had called ahead. I was not going to arrive unannounced. I was not interested in theater. And when I pulled up in the rental car and walked up the front path, the oak tree in the yard was larger than I remembered, its roots pushing slightly at the edge of the pavement the way old trees do, slowly and irresistibly reshaping the ground around them. My mother opened the door before I reached it. She looked older. They both did. My father behind her in the hallway, a little thinner, his hair fully gray now, his expression holding something I had not seen on his face before, a kind of reckoning that sat uneasily on features accustomed to certainty. My mother's eyes filled the moment she saw me, not with the dramatic tears of a reunion scene, but with the quiet, helpless kind that come when a person is confronted with the full weight of their own choices. I stepped inside. The house smelled the same: laundry detergent and old wood and the faint, persistent trace of coffee. Familiar in the way that only the places where you grew up are familiar, not just remembered but embedded somewhere below memory, in the body itself. We sat in the living room. I had brought copies of the relevant sections of the investigator's report. I set them on the coffee table without making a production of it. My father picked them up and read in silence for a long time. My mother watched his face as he read, and then read the pages herself when he set them down. Nobody spoke for what felt like several minutes. Then my father put his hands flat on his knees in that particular gesture he had always used when he was marshaling himself to say something difficult. And he said, "I didn't ask. I should have asked. I heard what she said, and I saw your face. And even then I didn't ask because I didn't want it to be complicated. I wanted it to be simple." He paused. "That is not an excuse. I know that." It was not an apology in the traditional sense. No formal, "I'm sorry," no request for forgiveness. It was something more uncomfortable than that, an honest accounting. I respected it more than an apology would have been, because apologies can be rehearsed and delivered cleanly, but honest accountings require a person to look at what they actually did and say so plainly. My mother cried, quietly, and did not try to explain herself, which I also respected. Vanessa arrived an hour later. I had known she was coming. Marcus had told me she wanted to speak with me, and I had agreed because I was no longer afraid of her, and because I thought I needed, for my own sake, to be in the room when she said what she needed to say. She looked diminished. That is the only word for it. Vanessa had always occupied space in a way that was larger than her physical body. The magnetism, the performance, the curated brightness. The woman who walked into my parents' living room that afternoon was physically the same size, but somehow smaller, the radiance turned off or turned inward, her eyes carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent a long time managing the consequences of a decision made quickly and badly a long time ago. She sat down across from me. She did not look at the papers on the table. She looked at me. "I was scared of him," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, the way a voice sounds when it has been kept controlled for too long. "Not scared the way. I don't want to make it dramatic. I wasn't afraid. He would hurt me. I was afraid of what would happen if he controlled everything. He was already doing it. With the money, with decisions. I moved that money because I needed something that was mine that he couldn't touch in case I needed to leave. That was all it was at the beginning." She looked down for a moment. "When he found the discrepancy, I panicked. I had about 6 hours to come up with something before he confronted me directly. And I thought of you. That's the worst part. I thought of you, and I thought, she has no way to prove she didn't. And I had already been building it in my head, a story that could work, and I used it. And then at the wedding I said it out loud, and it was real. And afterward I told myself you'd figure it out, that it would get resolved, that someone would look into it and see the truth. She paused. But no one looked. They just believed me. And by the time I realized how bad it had gotten for you, too much time had passed, and I didn't know how to undo it without destroying everything else. The room was very quiet. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, the way you can only look at someone when you no longer need anything from them. I had spent 5 years constructing, in the absence of contact, an image of Vanessa that was almost entirely villain, calculated, malicious, deliberately cruel. And she had been those things in that moment, in that vineyard. What I saw now was also true. She was a person who had been frightened and had made a terrible choice, and had spent 5 years living inside the consequences of it in ways that had quietly cost her as much as they had cost me, possibly more. I did not say, I forgive you. Forgiveness, in my experience, is not a single moment of declaration, but a long, private process that happens in your own time and does not require a witness. What I said was, I know why you were scared. I'm not going to tell you the choice you made was okay, but I understand how you got there. She nodded. She didn't cry, which surprised me that I think she had already done her crying in private in the months of cooperating with investigators and waiting for whatever was coming. What she had left was not grief, but a kind of stripped-down clarity, the same quality I had heard in my father's voice when he made his honest accounting, the look of a person who has stopped performing and is simply standing in what remains that we did not hug. We did not make plans. I stayed at my parents' house for 2 nights, and we talked carefully about smaller things, my job, my life in Denver, how the neighborhood had changed, why mother made my favorite dinner on the second night without making a production of it, just set it on the table and sat down, and we ate together in a way that was not yet comfortable but was, for the first time in 5 years, real. I flew back to Denver on a Sunday evening. The Rockies were visible through the descent, enormous and lit gold in the setting sun. And I watched them the way I always watched them when the plane came in, with the particular feeling of arriving somewhere that has, over time and through effort, become genuinely mine. The months that followed were not a fairy tale reconciliation. Things that break over 5 years do not heal in 5 months. But they moved slowly and genuinely in a direction that felt honest. My parents called more regularly, not with the stilted obligation of the 2 calls I had made from Denver in the first year, but with actual conversation. My father asking about the accounts I was managing, my mother talking about her clinic and the new people in the neighborhood, and gradually about herself in ways she had not used to be able to do. I flew back to Chicago 3 times in the first year after the meeting. Each time was easier than the last. Vanessa and I rebuilt something. I want to be precise about what it was. Not the sisterhood we had never really had, the one I had always half wanted and never quite found, but something more grounded and specific. We texted occasionally. We had a real phone call every few weeks. She was navigating her own situation. The divorce from Kyle, which came through in the spring, the legal arrangements that came with the investigation, the process of reestablishing her own financial independence, and her own sense of who she was outside of the person she had constructed for the benefit of everyone else's perception. We understood each other differently than we had before. Not warmly, exactly, but honestly. Sometimes honestly is the better thing. The partnership offer at the firm was waiting for me when I got back from that first Chicago trip. I took a week to think about it, and then accepted. I became a partner on the first of the following year, which also happened to be my birthday. A coincidence that seemed too neat to be real, but was. I kept running on Sunday mornings. I kept showing up to the trails above the city where the air was thin and cold, and the view of the Front Range stretched to both horizons, and there was nothing to be, in that specific hour, except a body moving through space, which is sometimes the most necessary and clarifying thing. People sometimes ask me, friends who know the story, colleagues who have heard pieces of it, what the revenge felt like. They ask it as though revenge were a destination, a specific moment where the scales visibly balance and something clicks into place and satisfaction arrives, clean and complete. I understand the question. I used to ask it of myself in the early Denver years when the wound was still active and the anger had not yet been converted into fuel. What is it going to feel like? I would ask myself when they know the truth. The answer, it turned out, was not what I had expected. There was no click. There was no clean arrival. What there was sitting in my parents' living room with the investigator's report on the table and my father's hands flat on his knees and my mother's quiet tears was something slower and more complex. A gradual release, like air being let slowly out of something that has been inflated too long. Not triumph. Not even satisfaction. Exactly. Something more like the return of a weight to its natural resting place. The restoration of something that had been wrongly displaced. The label family disgrace had been placed on me in a room full of witnesses, and it had done its damage, and it had been made in front of an audience that included every person whose opinion had once mattered to me. The undoing of it was not made in front of an audience. It was made quietly in a living room with documents on a table and the smell of coffee and the sound of my father's voice saying the thing that was hard to say. That is usually how true reckonings happen. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in the small, private moments where people finally look clearly at what they have done and say so plainly, I did not need a stage. I had never needed a stage. What I had needed was the truth. And the truth had eventually, in its own time and by its own logic, arrived. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from having survived something that was meant to diminish you and discovered that it did not. It is not the loud freedom of triumph or the performative freedom of revenge. It is quieter than that, a settled quality in the chest, a sense of groundedness, a knowledge that your own value does not depend on the recognition of the people who once failed to give it. You build your life. You build it carefully, day by day, in whatever city and whatever circumstance you find yourself in. You show up to your work and your friendships and your Sunday mornings with honesty and effort and the particular discipline of someone who has learned through direct experience that consistency is not a consolation prize. It is the thing itself. I am Alina Carter. I am 32 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado, where the mountains are visible from my office window, and the trails above the city hold the particular magic of elevation and open sky. I am a partner at a marketing firm that I helped build into something I am genuinely proud of. I have friends who know my full story and choose to be my friends anyway, which is the only kind worth having. I talk to my parents regularly and visit them a few times a year, and we are building slowly and imperfectly, something that resembles an honest relationship. I talk to my sister occasionally, and we are building, even more slowly, something that resembles a genuine one. I was called the family disgrace on the night of my sister's wedding, in front of every person who had ever known my name. And I want to say this clearly to anyone who has ever had a label placed on them by people who did not stop to ask whether it was true. The label was never mine. It belonged to the fear that created it and the silence that allowed it to stand. The moment the silence broke, the moment one text arrived from one honest person who had looked at the actual facts, the label dissolved. It had only ever been words. And words, even the most damaging ones, cannot survive the consistent pressure of a life lived with integrity. Build your life. Show up to it every day. Let the truth be patient, because it will be, it always is. And trust, even when trust feels like a form of madness, that the things made wrongly do not last. The things made honestly do. That is what I know now. That is what 5 years and one text and a living room in Naperville and 1,000 Sunday mornings on the trails above Denver taught me. And that, I think, is enough.